Thank you, Lisa. Digital media technologies, such as search engines and Instagram, require thinking critically across disciplines to address the inequities that they reproduce. Collectively, we can consider inquiries like what happens when machine learning uses dirty data to train models. Predictive programs like music or movie suggestions are only verified as true when they reproduce the patterns they learned from. Wendy Chun asks questions like, what if, rather than birds of a feather flock together, networks were organized around the notion of opposites attract? Chun has authored several books, most recently Updating to Remain the Same, Habitual New Media, and her forthcoming title, Discriminating Data, Correlation, Neighborhoods, and the New Politics of Recognition, is due out next month. She studies networked algorithms in order to understand the often troubling assumptions that are built into them. In this new book, she explores how data analytics and machine learning create agitating clusters of comforting rage by encoding a racist past. Chun notes, we need to question the tools and ask how the tools are constructed as we use them, if we are going to understand the ways that those tools perpetuate discrimination and in turn propose alternatives. With academic appointments in departments ranging from the history of science to law to the communication studies, Chun's expertise in systems design engineering and English literature morphs to address critical issues in new media and the social life of data. Currently the Canada 150 Research Chair in New Media at Simon Fraser University's School of Communication, Dr. Chun leads the Digital Democracies Institution, which she also founded. The institution integrates research in the humanities and data sciences to address questions of equality and social justice. It is my pleasure to welcome Wendy Chun to the 2021 Nobel Conference.
So thank you, Lisa, and the organizing committee for inviting me to this wonderful event, for giving me the opportunity to offer you a sneak preview of my forthcoming book, Discriminating Data. I'm really sorry that I'm not there with you in person to give this lecture. I've been watching the past year's lectures, and it's so clear that you have a vibrant and mixed audience. I'm in Vancouver, which lies on lands that were never ceded. It lies on the unceded traditional Coast Salish lands, including the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. And I thank them for caring for this land and for tolerating my presence on it. This land acknowledgement, as many have pointed out, is a small gesture. It's a small gesture, but it's part of an ongoing truth and reconciliation process. So for almost 100 years, Indigenous children from the age of 6 were torn from their families and communities, and they were placed in schools and dormitories in which they were under constant surveillance, and they were punished for speaking their own languages. They were maltreated, malnourished, and experimented on, all in the name of democracy and education. So the schools were sites of rampant tuberculosis, in part because the students were so malnourished and living in such close quarters. So what did those in charge do? Well, rather than providing them with more food, the nurses and researchers studied them for the effects of malnutrition and other diseases on child development. In other words, they viewed this as an opportunity to gather data. So not surprisingly, we keep finding unmarked graves of children, graves that survivors told us many, many years ago were there. And so this land acknowledgement opens up questions of ethics and research, and how research is tied into questions of politics, society, and culture. And it's an honor to end this conference by focusing us again on these issues. And I'll use our time together to explore the impact of social media and predictive algorithms on equity and justice. So what a crazy time we live in, right? A global pandemic, global weirding, increased polarization, and the rise in hate crimes. And a lot of people have blamed the internet for everything, right? They blame social media feeds and recommender systems for misinformation, for polarization, for spreading conspiracy theories and hate. And a recent Netflix docudrama filled with remorseful Silicon Valley tech executives, the Social Dilemma, for example, argues that the challenges that social media present are huge and unprecedented. And they're huge and unprecedented because social media recommender systems have hacked the human psyche. Personalized machine learning recommender systems have made us basically into stressed out lab rats. We're stressed out lab rats, or we're marionettes manipulated by evil tech dudes and algorithms that evolve faster than we can and that constantly push our buttons. So it's game over for humanity. At the same time, other folk have pointed out that this isn't new. Hatred, fear, they've been around for a long time. And blaming tech for everything keeps us from taking on fundamental issues. And what's key is that it isn't an either or, right? So if both these images seem persuasive, it's because they're part of the same chorus. This experiment to contain, to agitate, to provoke isn't new. And this history isn't over. And how we treat humans can't be separated from how we treat, build, and imagine machines. Through social media networks and their uses of big data and machine learning, we relive this history every day. This history has become ingrained in our habits. So social media networks and predictive programs, as they're currently formed and implemented, embed within themselves past mistakes such as segregation, internment, and eugenics. And by doing so, they make it really difficult for us to live and imagine a different present and future. So to make this clear, let's engage in a collective thought experiment. Okay. Now, so everyone, imagine or recall an image of a mythic yet flawed past. I'll supply a few. Here's the so-called perfect white suburban nuclear family, living in a segregated planned community in which everything's the same. Here's Lena, the Playboy centerfold that became, as Dylan Mulvin has shown us, the test image for modern image processing. And here are images of US celebrities. And US celebrities are the training set for many facial recognition systems. And here are images of Japanese American children allegedly happily educated in internment camps during World War II. So imagine that this deep fake past has become the only past. It's become the only past. So gone are images of civil rights protests. Gone are integrated schools and cross-racial friendships. Now imagine a world in which nothing could change from this deep fake past. Right? Imagine a world that nothing could change from this deep fake past because learning and truth equaled repeating that past. Okay. Got it? What you've just imagined is the nightmare scenario of predictive machine learning. And this is the world that we need to use Ariella Azoulai's term, this is the world we need to unlearn. And we need to unlearn it not by ignoring history, but by engaging history differently. Because within all these concepts and defaults lies other worlds and possibilities. Other worlds and possibilities. And helping us to listen to these other worlds, as Kara Keeling urges us to do, worlds that lie in wait, is what drives discriminating data. So, most generally, discriminating data explores how data analytics and machine learning create agitated clusters of comforting rage by encoding legacies of eugenics, segregation, and discrimination. And by taking on these issues, discriminating data is in dialogue with many recent books and articles written by Cathy O'Neill, Sophia Noble, Ruha Benjamin, Meredith Broussard, Kate Crawford, Virginia Eubanks, and so many others. And discriminating data does 5 basic things. The first is to expose and investigate how ignoring difference amplifies discrimination, how ignoring race ignorantly produces racism. And every day we hear about a new instance of what Cathy O'Neill has called weapons of math destruction, Sophia Noble has called algorithms of oppression, and Ruha Benjamin has called the new Jim Code. Right? From discriminatory predictive policing and risk assessment programs to unfair hiring programs. And the classic example of this, which almost everyone mentions, is COMPAS. COMPAS is a software program used by some US courts to predict the risk of recidivism, so how likely any person is to commit another crime. And basically, COMPAS asks inmates and law enforcement to fill out a questionnaire. These are entered into the computer, and then COMPAS spits out a score based on these answers. And then the score is factored in during sentencing and parole. Now, the problem is that COMPAS has been shown to be biased against racial minorities. And here you see the award-winning ProPublica article on COMPAS that Cynthia Rudin also showed us earlier in her wonderful talk. Now, what the researchers whom ProPublica drew from were able to show is that although COMPAS didn't overtly use racial categories, right? Using overtly racial categories is illegal. They used categories that are proxies for race in the United States. And here you see an analysis produced by the Marshall Project, and here you see how race is linked to factors such as education and employment status. Now, some have critiqued this, right, and argued that these factors aren't as important as others, that age and dirty data play a larger role than these proxies. This doesn't mean, however, that COMPAS's predictions aren't racist. So if you consider the over and under policing of certain neighborhoods in Canada and the US, age at time of arrest and dirty data, like education and employment status, are proxies for racism, if not race. And it's really key that we understand the difference and the relationship between the two. Because COMPAS was actually initially sold as solving the problem of racism. It was sold as solving the problem of racism because it would eradicate individual human bias. So the idea was, because the program can't see race, it can't be racist. This assumes that racism naturally stems from visual markers of race. And that pretending visual markers don't exist somehow solves the problem of racism. So we shouldn't be surprised that things have turned out so poorly. Rewriting political and social problems as one's technology can and should solve never goes well. Right? This hopeful ignorance isn't new. And the failures of this hopeful ignorance aren't new. And they also drive fears over the AI apocalypse. AI is so threatening right now because AI and surveillance devices are sold as modern-day servants or slaves. Okay? So this framing with all of its baggage, right? What could go wrong in a society run by servants or slaves? Right? This framing with all of its baggage provokes fears of revenge. It provokes fears of them as our masters. And these fears and dreams are, as Jenny Rhee has shown us, profoundly raced and gendered. And one thing I do in the book is to address the two sides of this hopeful ignorance together. Because the best way to avoid an AI apocalypse is to treat everyone and everything with respect. To follow the Combahee River Collective's call to treat everyone as levelly human, and to follow Jason Edward Lewis's, Noelani Arista, Archer Petrawis's, and Suzanne Kite's call for us to make kin with our machines. Right? Because freedom is only freedom if it's freedom for all. And anxieties over AI and discriminatory algorithms, they actually open up opportunities for coalitions, right? So think of the ways in which civil rights activists and civil liberty groups have gotten together to take on facial recognition technology, right? So this is a moment for new coalitions to arise. The second thing that discriminating data does is to interrogate default assumptions and axioms that ground algorithms and data structures. So in the book, I look at correlation, homophily, authenticity, and recognitions. So very briefly, because it's impossible to summarize 5 years of research into 30 minutes, I show how overblown promises about correlation tie early 21st century data analytics or hype about big data to early 20th century eugenics. So correlation, which allegedly powers big data machine learning, right, makes knowledge mean an ability to predict the future rather than know the past. Correlation was actually developed a century earlier by eugenicists to show that learning was impossible. Right? And here you see the resonances between 20th century hype over correlation by eugenicists and 21st century hype about correlation by promoters of big data. I also show how homophily, and this is the notion that similarity breeds connection, ties social networks to US residential segregation. So our current social networks presume homophily. They presume that birds of a feather flock together, which means that echo chambers aren't an accident, they're a goal. Segregation's the default. In fact, the very term homophily comes from studies of post-World War II US residential segregation. And through this concept of homophily, which is baked into recommender systems, US residential segregation or attitudes towards it spreads globally. And hate gets laundered into love. So homophily emphasizes love rather than hate, right? It's love of the same. But how do you show you love the same? By fleeing when others show up. I also look at how authenticity, how deviations and transgressions grounds training and transparency. So on social media and in our workplace, we're constantly called on to be authentic by revealing some intimate yet open secret about us, an open secret that somehow makes us different from some others. And by revealing this open secret, we show that we have nothing to hide, that we're authentic because our insides and our outsides coincide. Now, these open secrets are valuable because they're used to cluster us, to put us in network neighborhoods with others like us, others who agitate us and charge us, right? So networks magnetize and disintegrate masses, right? So think of that physics experiment where you had that massive iron filings and then you put a magnet underneath them, right? This is what networks do. Networks magnetize and disintegrate masses and then consolidate these angry clusters of sameness around a common enemy. So that we now become predictable, not by following mainstream norms, but rather by deviating slightly from them with others. So, in other words, we become most predictable not when we show that we like something like Harry Potter, whom millions of people like, but we like something like Napoleon Dynamite, right? And this leads to the bizarre situation in which the norm we aspire to has become never be a normie. So Apple, one of the largest corporations in the world, has made a fortune by getting us to think different. Fox News broadcasters rail against the mainstream media, even though Fox News is the most popular channel on basic cable in the US. And lastly, discriminating data looks at how recognition, from facial recognition technology to the radical rights embrace of the politics of recognition, builds on discrimination, on a powerful and poisonous liberation envy. And as Cynthia Young has pointed out, there's a bizarre way in which people who seek to deny other people's civil rights disidentify with and as civil rights heroes. Step 3 is to grasp the past, present, and future machine learning puts in place, focusing on when and why and how their predictions work. So what's key again is that in machine learning, truth equals consistency, the future equals the deep fake past. So as Adrian Mackenzie has put it, learning is comprehensively understood in machine learning as finding a mathematical function that could have generated the data and optimizing the search for that function as much as possible. So in other words, learning is parsimonious repetition. So the problem with machine learning as it currently exists isn't simply that it's trained on dirty or highly selective data. Again, Hollywood celebrities lie at the heart of many facial recognition technology sets. And here what you're seeing are so-called deep fakes produced using this set. So the problem isn't simply, as this example makes clear, that ground truth equals deep fake, right? Think of Hollywood stars. But that these so-called predictive programs are verified as true only if they reproduce this data, right? So they're verified as true when they reproduce this data. So COMPAS, like all predictive machine learning programs, COMPAS wasn't tested on its ability to predict the future. It was tested on its ability to predict the past. So basically, it was trained on a certain set, and what would happen usually in these programs is that a certain part of the past set is hidden, right? And these programs are tested on its ability to predict these hidden values, or it's tested on out-of-set data. And in these models, truth equals consistent repetition. And why this matters is because these programs, they don't simply predict the future, they also determine the future. So risk assessment software like Compass cement and amplify inequalities through their decisions. So in other words, these programs are disruptive if they are, not because they make possible new unforeseen futures, and this is how disruption is usually talked about in the Valley, right? These programs are disruptive if they are, not because they make possible new futures, but because they shut down the future by making it repeat a deepfake past, by automating, not learning from past mistakes. Okay, but if this is so, what can we do, right? So step 4 is to use existing AI systems to diagnose current inequalities. So to keep the future open, to create a more just and democratic future, we need to be a little perverse. We need to read the discriminatory results of these algorithms against the grain. We need to read them against the grain as evidence of past discrimination. Right? So Amazon, for example, stopped using its secret hiring program a few years ago because it was shown to discriminate against women. Right? So if you had women anywhere on your CV, you lost some points. But rather than simply discarding these programs, what if we use them as evidence? Right? So almost every Amazon hiring decision during a certain time period was probably used to train this program. So what if we thank them for meticulously documenting their discrimination? Right? So think again of Compass. Compass presumes that racism stems from individual bias. Right? As many of you are probably aware, sentencing varies with a judge's circadian rhythms. This is why a good trial lawyer will always try to schedule a trial in the early afternoon, after lunch, right? Because you're far more likely to get a harsh sentence if you go before lunch when the judge is hungry. So Compass did make things more consistent. It got rid of individual bias, but by replacing individual with institutional bias, which means, again, to read against the grain, what Compass actually shows us is that racism is an institutional rather than an individual problem. Right? So in addition to producing more interpretable models, what if we use these programs with all their limitations as historical tools? What if we use them as theoretical probes? In other words, what if we treated them like we do global climate change models, right? So global climate change models show us a likely future based on the past, not so that we'll accept that future, but so we'll change it. And global climate change models make absolutely clear the difference between being true and being correct. Right? The point of global climate change models, the point isn't to be correct in a narrow sense of the word. Right? It isn't to determine how accurate any given prediction is. The point of a global climate change model is to act in such a way that we don't have to verify these predictions, right? So the point is not having to produce a graph like this. When a model shows a 2% increase in mean temperature, we seek to fix the world, not the model. And this arguably should be our reaction to Compass, right? Rather than fixing the program, we should try to fix the world, because Compass shows us how racism works through age, through dirty data, through education and employment status. The problem, of course, with global climate change models is that we've known they've been true for a long time, but nothing's happened. which raises the question, do we really need more models? For whom is global climate change news? How can we avoid producing models that document the obvious, and that document the obvious and serve as alibis for inaction? So step 5, the ultimate goal is to create different worlds, different algorithms, different relations that engage the richness of relations and knowledge unfolding around us. And to do so, it takes up Kara Keeling's call to listen with others for the poetry, the refrains, and the noise a world is making. And in the book, I argue that not only the problems, but the outlines of a solution can emerge from in there. Not because technology lies outside of culture, but because technology and culture are always fused together, right? Because we can listen for those worlds in these technologies. The past history, as Azulai insists, isn't lost. Rather, it's a space of potential. It's a space of potential history if only we can unlearn our exploitative relationship to the past and engage with those who've been relegated to the past as potential companions, not as sources of information. Right? So think back to the example of the residential schools that I started with. And so the book revisits and emphasizes the populations that lie at the heart of our networks and defaults. Residents of Addison Terrace, Japanese internment camps, married student housing at MIT, civil rights activists, slaves, unruly women, workers at Western Electric, housewives in Decatur, and punishment-averse mice, to name a few. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Well, let's return briefly to the housing study that termed the coin homophily. So the Columbia Bureau of Applied Sociological Research, which was then led by sociologists Robert K. Merton and Karl Lazarsfeld, conducted a study of 2 housing projects. The first housing project, and it was the housing project that inspired this study, was Crafttown, a cooperatively owned project of some 700 families in New Jersey. And the second housing project, which they chose to contrast the first, was Hilltown, a biracial low-rent project of about 800 families in Western Pennsylvania. Now, what's key is that they didn't assume homophily to be always true. Instead, they asked, what are the dynamic processes through which similarity or opposition of values shape the formation, maintenance, and disruption of close friendships? And they noted that in these communities, status homophily wasn't the norm, with the exception of gender and race. And they hypothesized that this status homophily was actually due to value homophily, was actually due to the fact that people who share similar values tend to cluster together. And to prove this, they concentrated on the over-selection of white liberals and illiberals as friends, where friend equals one of your 3 closest friends, whether or not they live in the housing project or not. And where liberal means believing in biracial housing and thinking that folk in Hilltown, the housing project, get along. Illiberal is the opposite, and where ambivalence didn't believe in that housing should be biracial, but thought that folk in Hilltown got along. And what's key is that to make this point of value homophily, they actually threw out the responses of all the Black residents, who they said had there were too few illiberal or ambivalent residents with friends in the project. Right? And in their subsequent analysis and model of friendship formation, they also ignored the white ambivalence, and the category of white ambivalence was actually the largest category of white residents. And they ignored them because they said that white ambivalence had to be an unstable category, that in the end, you had to become either liberal or illiberal. Right? Now, they never published the data for this study. And if they did, we would have seen that the over-selection of white illiberals in real numbers wasn't statistically significant. And in the study, they say that. Right? And their study also revealed, and this study was written by Merton, Patricia West, and Maria Yehuda. This study, which was actually used during the case for desegregation, this study revealed that Black and white residents did have friends and acquaintances of the other race. But to come up with the term homophily, this network of friends, right, they ignored the responses of Black residents. But without these Black residents and ambivalent white residents, there would be no homophilic ties. So they're the gaps that make networks possible. And the history of networks, and what you see here is a revisiting and reimagining of the housing study by Karina Albrecht, who's a brilliant graduate student in the Institute, right? And she's filling in the gaps with these missing friendships, right? And the history of networks is filled with sociological studies of others who ground our concepts and make connection possible even as they're made to disappear, right? Such as Japanese Americans who were interned in camps during World War II. US and Canada interned all Japanese and Japanese Americans and Japanese Canadians living on the West Coast during World War II. Notably, they didn't do the same for Germans or Italians. And studying these internees was actually crucial to the development of sentiment analysis and techniques for managing people in occupied lands under stress, right? And sentiment analysis is key to social media networks and to behavioralist manipulation, right? So it's key to what's happening now in social media networks. These populations, these connections are still there. They inhabit correlation. They inhabit homophily. They inhabit recognition and authenticity. We live in their spaces when we live in social media. And they reside with us and touch us whenever we think through these concepts. So the question before us is, how might we reside with them? How might we reside with them? Thank you.
Welcome back from our last lecture of Nobel 57. I'm again here with my colleague, Colleen Stockman of the Art and Art History Department. And I might say that Colleen is indeed an artist as well as an art historian. And in particular, Colleen, you do in fact study the history of data visualization, something that has been explored and discussed and utilized a great deal during this conference. So I'm just really curious, as someone who's interested in that, what can you observe about the role of data visualization in this conference, and maybe particularly with respect to Professor Chun's talk?
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think that keeping the human component in mind and the very strategic, consistent design choices behind the histories of data visualization are critical to these problems that our scholars during the conference are addressing now. So we go a bit further back in the class that I'm teaching right now, and we look at 13th century maps of the world to surprisingly be able to decode, even for students who have no background info. You can really tell a lot just by looking critically and closely at how exactly that information is being constructed. So what's in the center? Oh, that looks like it says Jerusalem. That's right. Why might it say Jerusalem? Why would that be in the center of the world? So by bringing things back and giving them some historical context, even how maps, for example, were initially designed, we can bring a lot to understanding the human impact of data use and design systems today.
And you mentioned, so Colleen and I were having one of those exciting conversations that can happen when you're actually in the room with the person watching a talk. It was very exciting for me this year. And we were talking about the ways in which thinking about the gaps in between the networks is something that can be thought about through this notion of data visualization. I wonder if you could reprise a little bit of our whispered conversation during the talk.
Yeah, I think this goes to questions of audience, of thinking about who a particular piece of information or designed data is for, and it goes back to trying to comprehend big data as a whole. And what if it weren't as much about spreadsheets multiplied and writ large into three-dimensional things we can't even comprehend, but it was actually about kind of the bigness of the human population and bringing that down into the person-to-person network connection and really investigating those spaces between people, which are where translation, right, having a common language to talk among disciplines is a big topic that's come up with all of our speakers. So what kind of attention we can pay to those gaps, as Dr. Chun was just demonstrating here at the end, and what can we learn from not just looking from data point to data point and the complexities of how we can turn those into algorithms and machine learning, but then how to make it tiny. How can we make big data tiny in order to keep it human and remember the material effects that all of these bits of data have, both coming from people and, just as Wendy Chun was saying, that all of those individuals that she's highlighted, that we look at in my class, they all reside with that information, with these systems, in these devices. So is keeping them at the fore of understanding how our world is designed today also part of how we make better decisions about which types of data we use to train machines and what types of algorithms we're pointing at which problems and what kinds of questions we're asking, which is
Professor Chun ends her talk with that really, I found, haunting question: how might we reside with them? And of course, a very complicated we indeed. She's referring, as she says, to the people who make connections possible even as their presence disappears. So if knowing the past lives of data systems can inform present and future decisions, what might it mean to reside with the people that inhabit or haunt those systems? What might that mean?
Yeah, I think this is a big, deep question, but is pertinent to helping us get comfortable with discomfort and the learning that occurs when we cannot come up with a clear answer to how do we reside with the individuals that completely inform how we use data today, how sentiment analysis is created, et cetera. I think in some ways it's an important, impossible question, and that its presence is the answer in some ways. I know that may feel a bit abstract, but I think back to, in the way that I look at design, I'm also, as an art historian, looking at data design and design writ a bit larger. So we look at things like architecture and how spaces are planned as also being data that tells us something about the social lives of the people that created those things. So this comment that Dr. Chun makes about, kind of designing their own disappearance resonated with studies we have in architecture, especially around enslavement and things like the dumbwaiter and different elements of kind of concealing the labor that enslaved individuals were forced to become the architects of their own invisibility. And I'm sure there's a citation there that I'm missing on camera at the moment, but this is a critical piece to not just how data is visualized and designed, but how our whole world is designed and visualized, and who it privileges, and just how complex the kind of act of disappearance and sort of forced disappearance is present in all of our information design.
What Dr. Stockman just said is an illustration of the kinds of conversations that we have as we are planning the Nobel Conference for 2 years. I have to just pause in medias res here, because I'm sort of stunned by what I have just learned. And I just want to say, I think every one of us on the committee had one of those moments probably every month where we went, oh my God, I've never heard that before. I did not know that. And I didn't know that I was in the presence of someone who knew that. And that changes everything for me. So that is, again, speaks to what all of our panelists have been saying over and over again about the value of working in these deeply interdisciplinary teams. And, you know, one of the sad things about the Nobel Conference interdisciplinary team is we kind of dissolve and go back into our places at the end of a conference preparation. But the kind of learning that we've been able to do in these last 2 years is really well illustrated by what Colleen just said. And so I'm riffing for time a little bit while I allow another part of my brain sort of absorb what she just said, honestly. Another really important thing about what Dr. Chun said in this talk was that the point of climate models, and again, when she said this, I thought, yeah, exactly. It isn't to say, look at that, we're going to do that, we're going to have our climate warm in exactly that amount, right? It's to say, let's not have the model be right, in a sense, or let's have the prediction show us what we want to do to avoid the prediction. So how can we better determine whether we even need new models? Or as she put it, I want to directly quote her here, how can we avoid producing models that document the obvious and serve as alibis for inaction? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so glad we have these intense questions to tackle that, again, I'm not sure have super clear answers. I think this brings up really important concerns to me about which tools are used for which problems. And again, this has come up with the panelists, but it's certainly something we look at in terms of the history of how information design has developed over time and in different places. And a huge part of that is also related to print technologies and different kinds of technologies since the beginning of, the reproducible word. And that becomes a question today when there are so many tools and devices. What are the stakes of experimenting with those tools without asking questions first, or sort of what is the order of operations of which algorithms are pointed at which problems, and talking in a bit of a circle here, but I think that's part of the point of concern around echo chambers and being careful about just how strategic and careful we are with, actually, this comes up of the care for the question that I think was in the panel earlier today, that one of the things that we can do is to come together across disciplines, because all disciplines are broken, as Wendy said yesterday, I think, and agree about the care for the question and sort of coming together, knowing what our limit events are. So this goes back to the technology piece maybe of, we reach a point where we need to do something that lithography can't do anymore, like print in color. So we figure out a way to boost that technology and use, photo processes and come up with chromolithography or whatever. That's not a perfect example, but my meaning is just that I think part of what's exciting to me about looking at Dr. Chun's talk and this topic is that where I am sort of in the further deep past with some of these questions, a lot of those issues are repeating themselves today about how technologies develop, why they develop, and which questions lead us to creating the right tools to address problems in effective ways, which always is going back to are we asking the best questions we can ask? And do we agree on what the question is in order to move somewhere?
Mm-hmm. And as Professor Osorio pointed out this morning, if we don't ask the right question, we're not going to have very much luck in formulating the right model. But of course, when the right question turns out to be a proxy for the question that we would rather ask, but there's no way to measure, suddenly I need a drinking straw to get to the surface, right? Really challenging issues. Also, Wendy Chun said the way we treat humans can't be extracted from how we treat machines. And also, freedom is only freedom if it is freedom for all. And this morning in the opening comments, Tom LaFaro pointed out that people write code. Gosh, we sometimes forget that, don't we? So how do we humanize big data in order to do we treat machines as kin? Or how does acknowledging that it's people behind the code, people behind the writing of code, how can that maybe help us as we try to think about the transformative potential of new media and the liberatory and justice-facing potential of new media? Yeah. Another small question.
Yeah, another small question. I'm just remembering an anecdote that maybe I can paraphrase briefly. But when I was working at Stanford, at the Stanford Museum, the Cantor Art Center, I was working on a collaboration with augmented reality app for the museum to kind of reveal layers of conservation data through a mobile device while looking at the artwork in person, if that makes sense. That context wasn't actually necessary, but the point is I was working with a lot of computer science people at Stanford, and so I'm going to these meetings, and at one point somebody was talking about these, and then it was about image recognition software. So these different questions about coding image and training machine learning, essentially, about how to recognize different types of things happening in photographs. And the individual I was talking with kept referring to Turkers. And I was like, what is that? And he's like, tried to shame me for not knowing what it was. And I was like, I'm in the art department. I don't know. What is a Turker? And he's like, oh, Amazon Turkers. And I was like, what? I was still trying to understand. It's a person, as it turns out. This individual wasn't able to think of that worker as a human being across the globe. But essentially what he was getting at was that when they come up with the right codification language, then they can shove that off to basically an extremely invisible and underpaid labor source to code images writ large. And, this isn't my field. I don't know how much this is even used today because this was a minute ago, right? We've maybe trained devices to do some of this now. But it absolutely shook me that there was that much disconnect between cutting edge computer science department and the people who do the labor with the ideas that they come up with. And so it just kind of, it really struck me. And what's funny in a horrific way is that we actually use the story of the Mechanical Turk in art history rather frequently to demonstrate both the kind of amazing technological advances of the early modern period, as it's one of the first automaton, which is a story we don't have time to get into, but that all of these things have historical legacies and contemporary real-world material effects on humans, is the piece that seems to sometimes get lost in the big picture of big data.
It's a great story. Wow. Well, our time is, of course, fast fleeting, and so I want to ask you about the poll. So one of the goals of the conference was to highlight ways in which the analysis of big data can be used to promote social good. And so if you haven't participated in the poll yet, you still have a second to do so. Pollev.com/Nobel Conference, or 22333 is the number. Type Nobel 57. You'd think I'd remember it by now. So let's see what the answers to that question were. Big data analysis is a valuable tool to be used. It should not be used by government agencies. Big data analysis should have a governing organization. Big data analysis should be unregulated. And our winner is...
Wow, that's such a specific... Big data analysis is a valuable tool to be used as long as steps are taken to prevent bias. So that's interesting because most of the other polls have had quite a bit of range in the responses, right?
And this one is pretty much, two things even received really any measurable votes. It is a valuable tool as long as and we can see actually after these 2 days how easy it will be to take steps to prevent bias, right? Let's do that after, this evening.
Right, yeah, we'll just fix that.
I don't mean to be flip, but it would be, I wish we could count the steps that would be taken to prevent bias in big data. Yeah, I would love to be able to do that. Indeed. Well, Colleen, thanks so much for joining me and for enlightening me. And I really appreciate your time today. And with that, we will transition to our last of 4 panel discussions on which we will focus on 2 talks. The talks that we have just seen by Professor Vaidyanathan and Professor Chun.